Now, nature abhors a vacuum, but so does politics. Right now, in case you hadn't noticed, the country's kind of falling apart. Our NHS has been in relentless meltdown. Our public services, like education, have faced devastating cuts. Our infrastructure in much of Britain is what you'd expect in a country far poorer than our own. Our living standards have fallen on average at an unprecedented level. If we look at our utilities, well, energy bills doesn't really need discussing, does it? I think we've got that covered in all our heads. Our privatised rip-off farce of a railway system, again, what more needs to be said? And of course, our shit-spewing water industry. Now, these are all issues that a courageous opposition would be speaking truth to power about relentlessly, about the disaster enveloping the nation and offering a clear alternative. Sorry to say it, guys, but we don't really have that one. Oops. Which is why the likes of the veteran consumer champion, Martin Lewis, has filled the vacuum, and we will see him kick some Tory arse. Now, these clips have been discussed elsewhere, I know, not least by my good friends at Novara. But I've got my own things to say, my own things to add to the discussion. So let's start with the tragic excuse of our Secretary of State for the Environment, Therese Coffey.
The water companies have apologised this week, and you've pointed out that they are under investigation. But what has made a lot of our viewers really cross is not just, as Lynn Pritchard is asking, why has the government over years allowed sewage to be discharged into rivers and seas, but why, she emails, do we as consumers have to pay extra for this to be cleaned up? Because yes, the companies are promising billions on this, but those billions are going to go onto our bills. Why should consumers pay?
Well, one thing is very clear: consumers will not be paying for the penalties or fines that the Environment Agency can levy, and indeed Ofwat as well. So there's an element there where that is already has to be taken account, that the polluter pays principle. In regards to ongoing investment, there's been a record amount of investment that we've seen since privatisation, and as well as, I'm very conscious there have been dividends too. I think last year it was just under 4% repaid. But
my question is, why should consumers have to pay? The water companies, I believe, had £2 billion in dividends recently to shareholders. So why should consumers have to pay to clean up their mess?
Well, consumers aren't going to be paying for the illegal discharges, the fines and penalties that have already been levied. But there has to be ongoing investment in these things. We've seen, not far from here, we've got the Thames Super Sewer. It's a multi-billion-pound project that's taking over 10 years to do. That will eradicate pretty much all of the need to use storm overflows in the future. But I'm conscious, and that's why we've asked Ofwat to have taken advantage of the powers they asked for to link environmental and performance to the payment of dividends. I know several of the water company chief executives are not taking bonuses, but what I will say is that we continue to make sure we've got this plan. Water UK have talked about £10 billion. That's about the figure we were expecting them to invest by the end of this decade, and they need to get on with the job and tackle this, including the storm action overflow plans, which I'm expecting on my desk at the end of next month.
Okay.
Yeah, all a load of nonsense, that, isn't it? And in fact, before we bring Martin Lewis on to take the Tories apart quite comprehensively, let's listen to that well-known lefty rag, that den of socialism, the Financial Times, which published an article back in 2017 headlined "Water Privatisation Looks Little More Than an Organised Rip-Off." Now, what the article noted was that over the past decade, the 9 main English water companies have made £18.8 billion of post-tax profits in aggregate, according to a study by Greenwich University, and of that, £18.1 billion has been paid out as dividends. So the capital expenditure, they note, has been financed by adding to the company's debt piles, which then, back in 2017, stood at £42 billion, a completely ludicrous and unsustainable business model. As the Financial Times noted, in the long run, this approach is clearly unsustainable, but they said Ofwat, the regulator, permits it because it takes no interest in the company's capital structures as long as they retain investment grade ratings. So they're just taking, your bills, they're making an absolute packet out of that. They're not using that for investment. They're relying on debt instead, which is completely and utterly unsustainable. That's what a profiteering model will do for you. Now let's just listen to Martin Lewis taking on those Conservatives.
It was nice, at least after your questions on sewerage, to finally be able to say accurately that was a politician definitely talking crap. So, and you look at the water industry. What did we do with water? We privatised it, but with no competition. Well, when you have privatisation without competition, you have regulatory capture. The regulators clearly aren't working well enough, and therefore we're in the position that we're in. We seem to have got the worst of both worlds.
We do actually have one water company that is still owned by the public and not for profit, and that's Welsh Water. And in fact, in Ceredigion and Gwynedd, we have some of the worst pollution of our rivers in England and Wales. So, whether they're private companies or not,
are you saying the way the water industry works as a whole is a good thing, or are you trying to cherry pick one example? My point is,
I'm not.
What was the benefit of privatisation? What was the benefit of privatisation without competition?
We've seen record
and do we have regulatory? Who's in charge? Is it your government's fault or the regulator's fault? What's happened? It must be one of them.
But we have
so
one
is it the regulator or your government?
Your point, I think, if I may, was that you were saying privatisation is a bad thing and has led to this failure of investment. I'm just saying there is a real life comparison we can use, which is well.
That's not what I said. I said we had privatisation without competition, which seems to be the worst of both worlds. I'm not sure why we did it. Why did we do one without the other? If you're going to have a privatised system, surely you have to have competition to make the markets work in a market theory, or you have regulation.
Boom. Yeah, quite the little cherry pickers, aren't they? These little cheeky little Conservatives. Let's go back, in fact, just to bolster Martin Lewis's point. Let's go back to that little comradely rag, the Financial Times, with yet another raging lefty to back up Martin Lewis on the whole point about cherry picking, Camilla Cavendish. Now, also writing, as I say, in the Financial Times. Now, who's this comrade? Who's this raging lefty, socialist, commie-like figure? She's actually the former director of policy for David Cameron and became a Tory lord until becoming a non-affiliated peer. I think we've established her credentials. She ain't no lefty. Now, her article was headlined, "Privatising water was never going to work." And she wrote in 2022, "It's time to admit that water privatisation has been a failure." And the point, and this is where we get to the point about cherry picking, because as she notes, in 1989, the sell-off was touted as the route to greater efficiency and investment. But between 2002 and 2018, Scottish Water, which remains publicly owned, invested on average nearly 35% more per household than English water companies, according to researchers at Greenwich University. I mean, I think it speaks for itself there, doesn't it? We can see there a successful model where you didn't get privatisation in Scotland, and look what's happened. They've invested because they're not wasting that money on dividends. It's basic arithmetic, isn't it? Do you get the money you've got and do you reinvest it in your service, or do you give it to shareholders for dividends? Very straightforward. And if you're going to do capital infrastructure, do you rely on debt instead, which is what these water companies have done? Now, I think this opens up, obviously, a broader discussion about the nature of public ownership. Because if you look, for example, take Paris. Now, what Paris did is they brought their water supply under public ownership. They brought down leaks. They drastically improved performance. But also, for example, what they did is they introduced water taps across the city, including sparkling water, which got ridiculed when people on the left said we could bring that here. People are like, oh my God, look at how ridiculous the left is talking about sparkling water taps. If it's good enough for Paris, why isn't it good enough for Britain? But that was made possible in Paris because their water company, get this, isn't just some state-owned entity. They have elected representatives from the community, trade unions, workers and so on. So they bring in democratic involvement to how they can make the water industry work for Parisians, which is why you end up with sparkling taps. That just shows people go, oh, the private sector is where you get all this ingenuity and innovation and all the rest of it. Well, I think I'd swap Paris's water industry for a shit-spewing joke, because when they took their water industry back under public ownership, across the board, all the indicators showed a massive, drastic improvement in the water industry for consumers and for the citizens of Paris. That's what we should be talking about. It has been a failure. Whatever you think about privatisation as a principle, flogging off natural monopolies doesn't work. You're never going to get competition on the in water, in energy, in rail, in any meaningful way, which is why you should integrate them and use the money, not for dividends, but reinvesting in the service and in people's bills, and also providing a stream of income to the Treasury for other means as well. It's an obvious no-brainer, but I'm afraid to say the Tories are never going to accept that, and Labour have abandoned public ownership, so which is why we have the likes of Martin Lewis filling the vacuum. But I think there's going to be a fair few others including people watching this video, who are going to fill the vacuum as well. Please like and subscribe. And also, if you're listening on the podcast, hello, do support us on patreon.com/OwnJonesFoot. I'll see you in a bit.